colleagues, let's make a start, because this is going to be a fascinating day. We've got the most wonderful people on this call, so this should be quite an evocative 50 minutes for us all to share. So let me, as I always do, start with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, elders past and present, and any Indigenous colleagues with us today. Look, this is an interesting one, this one. So we're at, finally, the promise of happiness. We're at Duke University Press, and we're at 2010. So we're starting to move into the modern component of Sara Ahmed's career. This is a fascinating, complicated, intricate book, and I will be fascinated to see how colleagues work with this today. And the rules are always, for our colleagues that are just joining us for the first time, it's relaxed, it's groovy, there's no worries, everything is fantastic. This is about you, this is about your fabulousness. So if you've got something to say, then let's just do that. And so let's start. And so I'm going to start with Karima. Karima, are you happy if you and I start? Can we start? Can we start, you and I?
Oh, how exciting. Okay.
Okay. And by the way, the hair is looking fantastic. I'm noting it each week, by the way.
Only God knows why I drew attention to my hair last week, honestly. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. I was just talking about streamlining your life and the whole happy housewife. You know, I picked up on that in this book and that whole, anyways.
Yes, no, and that's in some way, see, you and I are linked, and we were married in a previous life. And we'll get to marriage shortly. But where this book really starts, so Amanda might help us with this one too, is when we ask for happiness or we summon happiness, what are we actually asking for? And there's that great phrase, I think on page 1, where it's happiness is a wish, a will, and a want. So let's just start, you and I as a family, mate, think about definitions. So when you summon happiness as an aspiration, what are we doing there, mate?
Okay, well, I found her sort of discussion at the very end about the difference between, or maybe not the difference, but talking about the two terms, happiness and joy. So I felt like her whole book, which I did not do a close reading of, I did a quick reading of, so a lot of it may have been lost on me, so I do apologize. Now that I know it's on YouTube, I have to say in advance, like, you know, I said some funny things in the other weeks that I have to put a little note beside now. Anyways, joy versus happiness. So happiness is like a state. I find she describes it as, like, in her whole book, as a state of being. And then at the end, she talks about joy as sort of the moments that we experience, what I understand as the feeling of happiness.
Yes.
So once again, I keep reading her stuff and looking for it to do something different than what it's doing. So she's talking about happiness, but not in the way that my brain is used to thinking about talking about happiness. So your question is a good one. What is she really, what are we doing? Are we making a wish? Are we, you know, and the other thing is she went through so many different definitions of happiness and trajectories of happiness, and happiness as lack and happiness as future. And so I don't know how to,
yeah.
It was very complicated. Lots of really, really cool, you know, thoughts that came out from her take on how to write a book about happiness.
Look, yes. And where I got stuck, and that's why we're going to go to Amanda, but because, hey, that's a great place for us to start, because I'm exactly the same. Where I was sitting with this book is happiness is a proxy. Okay, cool, proxy, cool, proxy. Then you try and unravel, or scaffold is probably a better verb, what's it a proxy for? And I think we end up in a very interesting narrative or story there, Karima. So look, you keep going there, because I might return to you, but Amanda, can you help me with this? So when we are summoning happiness as a life goal, what are we doing, my darling?
I always take her interpretation of happiness, particularly in this book, as an expectation of affect. So it's an expected result, an expected emotive response that's going to happen in some kind of future tense. Yes. It's never achievable in the present because of an embedded social and moral, she gets into the moral economy, that expectation of what happiness is and what it looks like. So she talks about the state of being, but this being of happiness, but she talks about happenstance and how it's almost involuntary in that kind of expectation, but it's so embedded in, and she talks about this about family, this expectation of happiness is that I will be happy if I will achieve happiness if I am a good parent, or I give happiness to others. So it's almost like she's removing herself from happiness and putting it in a future tense expectation, if that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I think that the conflict between happiness and joy is a really good point, Karima.
Yeah, look, I do too. And look, Amanda, I'm going to again come back to you in a second. I loved how you've talked about the moral economy there. My narrative that I'm going to be thinking through, and again, Thomas, I'll get you to help me with this one too, but I'm interested in the political economy of happiness. And talk to me, Amanda, talk to me.
Oh, no, but the political is almost embedded in the moral, or the moral is embedded in the political in a lot of ways, because you're talking about political economy, it's that distribution of power.
Yeah.
And expectations of morals, social mores are embedded in the political economy in so many ways.
Yes. Oh, that's fascinating. So moving from the political economy, so moving from Marx, I wonder, Thomas, if you and I can have a chat about consent. So let's carry the great phrase that Amanda's used there about the moral economy and the political economy. And Thomas, you and I had that great conversation last week about higher education and about the future of work. And I was deeply moved by that, Thomas. You did some remarkable work last week. But I did want to talk to you particularly about happiness and consent, because there was that old phraseology there, mate, where it was like, do we consent, and this is a quote, by the way, do we consent to happiness? And what are we consenting to if and when we consent to happiness? So that has sort of a bit of a Gramscian component to it, Thomas, doesn't it, mate? So it's a war of position, a bit of a consent stuff. So in many ways, we're asking not what happiness is, but what happiness can do. So can we, as humans, do you think, Thomas, withdraw from the happiness political economy? Can we deny it, displace it, marginalise it? Can we say we are post-happiness, mate?
I don't know if we can. One of the things that really brought to the forefront in my mind, because being in psychology, I have huge issues with the positive psych movement. And so I drew in kind of the idea of like how, if we're talking about like the political economy, or if we can consent to engaging in this, I wonder, like, I think about positive psych and self-help psych, and I'm like, this is just like commodifying and like selling this idea that even people without power can achieve power through their own personal, like, individualized interactions. And so it kind of like brought a very like Thatcherite, Reaganite, like neoliberal idea to the self-help movement, in that we're like selling you like this, isolated individual idea of happiness, while we strip away all of the joy through community, through involvement, through stuff like that. So I felt like it was very like happiness became like this very isolated tool of power for me, and kind of how it spreads through all sorts of disciplines.
So Thomas, mate, in your argument, gee, that's a powerful one. I can see Leanne just basically lost her head off her neck there. So you're arguing in many ways you can't get outside of happiness. That actually, you, even if you are trying to be post-happiness, it's like post-structuralism or post-colonialism, you never get outside. You can only reflect or critique on it and create some reflexive space, but you can't get outside of it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea of like Marxism. You can't be a socialist outside of capitalism.
No.
Like there is no alternative, to quote the Thatcher. So you have to pursue happiness, otherwise you don't have a choice.
So I'm going to push you, because obviously this is your expertise, Thomas. What does that do to us as citizens? So if we can't get outside of happiness, we can't get enough reflective space on it to see happiness as a project and negotiate our way through it, what is that doing to how we think about life and success and work and all those other variables we talked about last week?
I mean, I think it's the neoliberal utopia. Like, we're constantly marching towards this very individualized, solitary life. Like, we're moving towards, like, like, we're no longer, like, we shifted from community to the family unit to now the algorithms target us individually. And there's like this very like Bernays feel to it with this book that's kind of like we're taking the Oedipal and like we're selling you like you just need this thing to be happy. You just need this thing to be complete. And so if we can continuously pump you through with commodities, that'll satiate you and like give you the illusion that you're fulfilled, but really you're just happy.
Ooh, yeah. And look, Thomas, I'll quickly go, because I'll get your comment, then I'll go to Leanne on that, because where I believe the book was undercooked, and I think this is my fourth read of it, is I wanted desperately the commodification of happiness. I wanted to see that. And that great William Davis book, what was that? The Happiness Industry, was it, Leanne? William Davis, one of the greatest books I think ever written, to be honest with you. And that whole book was about how happiness is commodified. And for me, the commodification of happiness in this was a bit undercooked, Thomas. What's your vibe on it, mate?
I think it was undercooked. I think it laid a lot of really good groundwork to have that conversation. So I don't know if I would like say it's a drawback from the book, but it did like definitely act as a springboard for me to go, oh, Bernays, oh, self-help books, oh, the positive side. We just have to look at what makes people efficient and happy. And like efficient and happy are always kind of intertwined in a lot of ways. And so that definitely like provided the mental space for me to like bring these different pieces together. So I think the framework is excellent, but she definitely could have, I don't know if she needed to spell out commodified happiness for us.
Yeah, and I suppose that's my particular, because I suppose I'm wanting to understand class and happiness. I'm wanting to understand work and happiness, and the post-industrial nightmare that we're living in, and how what is left, what filaments of happiness are left for us. What's what actually is happiness now, and is it not necessarily defined by space now, but time? And so we've got these micro moments of happiness when we have a piece of cake, or we get it through these hypersensate moments that end really quickly.
We just have to self-care our way to death.
We just have to self-care our way to death. Oh, I love you. I love you. So that's a great time to introduce Dr. Leanne McRae. Leanne, help me with this one. You and I have just got to hang on here, because there's lots of conversations we can have. Let's just start with where are you on what actually is it? Is it a proxy, class, happiness? What's your vibe, darling?
Oh, gosh. Look, I think what I struggled with in this book is, and I think it stems from an issue with an earlier book of hers, where she talked about the distinction between sensation and emotion. And I don't think she really took that and pulled that apart in any great detail. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. Perhaps I missed that. But to me, I felt there was this really interesting terrain between fear, what a feeling is and what it means. And I feel there's a real, that's a gap in what she's doing here, that distinction between the state of being happy versus the feeling of being happy. And I think we don't know what happiness is.
No.
We absolutely don't know what it is. And instead, I think, yes, we do use happiness as a proxy, but it's not true happiness. It's what we think happiness is. And we're so surrounded by the commodification of happiness that we have substituted that for an actual feeling of happiness. And so she
says in the book, which I find so interesting, I'm not starting from a place where I'm saying that happiness is outside and it's located in a thing or an object. And she's correct to say that. But then I think she kind of does that. I think that she does kind of talk about how we seek happiness in these externalized interactions. But then she doesn't talk about how capitalism colonizes those externalized experiences, and you know, how we are filled up with how capitalism doesn't want us to find the state of being happy. It wants us to have the feeling of happy. And I think that is where I got very frustrated in the book, that I wanted to understand that moment. And I don't know if that helps us in any way here today, but that's where I was at with it.
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely right. I was after a classed interpretation of happiness. I think that's what I was after. But again, that exists in that great Davis book, I think. So that's what I wanted to understand, the happiness political economy. I wanted to understand injustice.
Yes, and I think that's actually really powerful, because I was thinking about this last night in terms of, we were talking a few weeks ago about the failure of the left and this and identity politics. And I think this is about empathy, and not in the way that perhaps people think, because I think what's happened is we expect that we can only understand injustice if we not just empathize, but we have to take on the emotional suffering of the other. Yeah. And I don't think, and this is controversial, I don't think we have to do that to see an injustice.
No.
And I think that that's what people are now rebelling against very strongly, is this tension between experiential suffering, how that relates to justice, and what that means for happiness. And I haven't unpacked that yet, but I think there's something there about, you know, the left wants us to empathise with the other, but they don't want us to, they want us to take it on. They want us to take on the burden of the other in order to be righteous allies. And I don't think we need to. I don't think we need to take on the suffering or the burden of the other to understand a political economy of injustice being in place.
And what's that injustice?
Yeah, and I think that suffering, that idea of suffering, is another way of blocking an interrogation of happiness.
Yeah, because in the old days that used to be called cultural appropriation. The idea that one must experience something to understand it is part of the anti-intellectual trope of our times. Now, again, a lot of people might disagree with me on that, but if we end up there, so we've got to experience all these different variables to be able to fight for the justice of people. That's quite concerning to, and I mean, it's nonsense, because the injustice confronted by a lesbian in Sydney is different from a lesbian in Tokyo. And if we pretend that experiential ideology about sexual identity and sexual behaviour is without context, then I think that's probably one of the most disturbing decisions we'd ever make, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. And I think that you can even extend that even further to say that this is a controversial idea, that while you're suffering, that I can't experience happiness while you're suffering. And that's a really powerful moment, I think, and a controversial moment.
Yeah, and look, and we need to go there, because this is, we need to be able to engage with social justice outside of identity politics.
Yes.
And that is going to take the brilliant people on this call 15 hard yakka research years to do that effort, to do that work. And it is research work. It's not living work. It's consciousness work, yes, but it's also research work. And of course, we'll now go, you've seen the comment straight from the Baxter. Baxter, I was going to go to you next about the happy housewife. I know this will come as a surprise to you, Beck. Beck, hi.
Hi.
So I better just explain for our international colleagues in the middle of the night, we have a Prime Minister called Scott Morrison. And in classic Australian parlance, we've retracted that to ScoMo. And ScoMo has some, what should we describe it as, some women challenges. And there's a very nasty workplace rape incident that's being investigated, alleged workplace rape incident being investigated at the moment. And ScoMo made the immortal phrase that he understands that a lot more now because he's got a daughter and his wife explained it to him. So it's one of those, Thomas. So yes, to take a breath. Yeah, Thomas, I know we're living that reality. So that's the context of our particular political agenda. And Thomas, I know it'll come as a surprise to you. He's from a right-wing party. So Beck, from my investigation there for Thomas and our colleagues in the UK, what do you want to say about this stuff?
Well, it was just like Leanne said, he doesn't need to feel that just because he has daughters, he can empathise with the worker. He should be empathising with her as a person who
as a human being.
As a human. So that's exactly what Leanne was saying. What else? What do I want to say? Was there a question? Was there a question?
Yeah, there is a question now. I just wanted you to have your vibe moment. As always, you did your magnificent vibe moment, just so everyone could engage with the fabulousness of your hair, and now we can engage with the fabulousness of your intellect. So the vibe I had for you this week was very much about, because your research, your PhD's working with this, how happiness is used to justify oppression, right? So the use of the word the happy housewife, or indeed the happy slave. So if you think about the great women that you're studying for your thesis, Baxter, how, have they been, inverted commas, happy, or is their discontent what fueled their writing? What's been the role of happiness in their personal, professional writing lives, do you think?
I think I would like to answer that in terms of the word Sara Ahmed uses is about the possibility, the gap between grasping terror as well as joy. And so that moment of possibility, perhaps for a 1950s housewife, has been narrowed down. So her possibilities of experiencing happiness has been whittled down because the possibilities are not there, so that the possibilities have been taken away. I also think there was something I wanted to, Sarah, I haven't got to your question properly yet, but I wanted to say about...
Keep going, Beck. Keep going, girl.
About when people get to the end of their lives, they always seem to look back with nostalgia and think, I was really happy then, but I didn't know it in the present. I was so busy doing things. I was so busy, buying, running around, being a happy housewife. And they get to the end of their lives and it's nostalgia and memory in retrospect that they think, I was happy, but I didn't know it at the time. Because happiness in the present looking forward is always that elusive, out of reach.
Yeah. Okay, so Beck, obviously I'm an old goth and I have several skulls on my desk because it reminds me that we're all this close to death. But Beck, is that nonsense? So in other words, when we're doing the nostalgia, looking back at the point of death going, God, 1987 was good. 1987, I was happy in 1987. Are you lying to yourself?
We do that now.
Talk to me, Liam. Talk to me, brother. So were you happy? Were you even born in 1987? You weren't born in 1987.
No, 2 years later.
So Liam, tell us about nostalgia in the past and happiness, mate. Go for it.
I think there's been so much nostalgia so where I live at the moment with this COVID situation, and it's making me really reflect on things. It's making me think about my very junior early career right now, where I sit, which side of social justice I sit on, what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, if I do get that far, nothing's guaranteed. So I don't think so. In kind of agreement but disagreement with Beck, I would also say you don't look back at the age of 80, especially in Britain right now. You're not looking back at the age of 87 because people don't even get to that age. But then again, I'm like, what, 29, giving away my age now. And I'm thinking like, you know, it can end right now, you know, with this virus, like with what's like our life force has been threatened.
And so, Liam, I'm glad you've gone there, because this is my line about post-happiness, Liam. So let's you and I do this, right? That I wonder if things are so mucked up now. And Thomas, you come in at any point you feel like this. The workplace is so destroyed. The families are so destroyed. The public commitments to health and education are so destroyed. Citizenship has broken down. Rioting is happening in capitals. We have disconnected from leaders. We don't have any leadership. So have we now lost that belief, that hope in happiness? So are we now, as citizens, as humans, pretty well now a bit feral, because we're no longer aiming for happiness, because finally we have stepped out of it. It's taken COVID and millions upon millions of people dying for that to occur. But have we snapped out of the bubble, Liam?
I'd say we're at a transient point where I'm kind of embracing banality at the moment and not happiness. I'm not on that record at the moment. I'm just kind of embracing like the banality of it all. And it brings me back to a quote that Sara Ahmed made, and I'm just on page 29 of Happy Objects. So expectations of happiness give us a specific image of the future, which I kind of disagree with. This is why happiness provides the emotional setting for disappointment.
Yes, now I'm loving the binary, and that's a whole thing. And let's go there now, mate. The binary of happiness and disappointment rather than happiness and unhappiness.
Yeah, because so many futures are not being actualized in this moment. So many transitions are being delayed, especially when I'm thinking about my own research as well. So it's kind of like we're in a transient moment, and it's been going on for nearly a year.
Yeah, and see, a transient moment is a year is a long time in any human's life, right? To be threatened, and as you've said, your family members have been sick. In the United Kingdom, sickness, has been incredibly serious in terms of the NHS, particularly in the Northwest, can I say? So this has been very serious for you. So this is not a transitory hiccup. This is a life reassessment for you. Oh, unbelievable. Look, can I bring Melanie in? Because Mel, your point's a great one about no one's ever going to say that 2020 was a nostalgic moment in our lives. In terms of Liam's commentary, Mel, has this resulted in some major transformations to your whole binarized happiness, unhappiness, happiness, disappointment thing?
That's interesting. I read this book in the context of before I did my PhD, so this has been a couple of years ago, I advised students at a very competitive, very privileged university, at a place where these students constructed a very definite vision of happiness for themselves that was wrapped up in achievement and status, and they were really quite miserable as they tried to achieve it. And so when I was working with these students, she said something in the intro. She said, the demand for happiness is increasingly articulated as a demand to return to social ideals, as if what explains the crisis of happiness is not the failure of these ideals, but our failure to follow them. And I felt like when I was working with my students, I was constantly trying to get them to critique the standard that they had created as a community for themselves, and try to figure out what they really valued and what might really bring them happiness, joy, fulfillment. So when I read this book, I'm thinking of my students all the time. But then Liam is just making these, and then I went to get my PhD, so I stopped doing that work, and now I'm not working with students on a day-to-day basis in the same way. And so now I'm listening to Liam's comments, and now I'm thinking about, well, how, if I were still in that role, how would those students be responding? And would they have had this kind of same realization that he is having, that all of that stuff
Oh,
Doesn't matter.
And look, Mel, it's incredible. And I'm looking at Thomas. Clearly, Thomas and I are sort of existentially linked, even though we're separated through this great distance. But Mel, I think our whole, and it's happened to me for a long time. It's probably happened to me because of my unstable working environment in the last 10, 15 years, right? Because I'm quite a senior academic, but, you know, I'm one day away from needing another job, right? So what that does to you as a human is a great deal, because then, you know, happiness and all that sort of stuff doesn't even cut it. That's not even in the vista. Just survival is the goal. So I wonder, as you know, and I run our PhD students, and my goal is to look after them. And what looking after them means is trying to get them a stable income. So the goals and hopes and dreams of, you know, be a professor and do this and get this fellowship and stuff, you know, just paying your bills. But then is that just because I'm an old goth, Mel, do you think? Or, you know, is that where we're at now? Is that the state of late capitalism?
Yeah, I think we kind of were there before the pandemic, but maybe not everybody realized it. And I think the pandemic has made more people realize just how negative an effect of late capitalism, as you're saying, is having on us and our desires, and what counts as happiness. And I think now we're realizing that, yeah, it's just a steady paycheck, so I can eat and not worry about paying rent would be nice and happy right now, you know, in some ways.
And that's incredible, isn't it, Mel? But I mean, that's changing everything. I mean, Thomas, is that going to change our universities? Because you and I want you to write this book, Thomas, just so you know. Thomas, is this going to change how we educate students? Is this going to change our universities? Because the promise of hope and happiness that was the promise of education, that's gone, isn't it, mate?
I actually don't know. I feel like if the pandemic was the thing that we're talking about it being, people would be a little bit more radicalized. And kind of building off of what Rebecca said earlier about looking back on your life and kind of Liam's comments, like I was wondering if happiness is just the proxy for self-esteem. And so one of the theories I play around with in my dissertation is terror management theory, which is problematic for its, you know, certain biological evolutionary elements. But the observation that our self-esteems are wrapped up in abiding around cultural norms, and that if you kind of scare people with their deaths, they're going to like lock up and get more normative and more bias. I wonder, like, if we're just kind of like retreating into ourselves and like making sure everything is okay, and we're just on this drip, drip, drip of capitalism making us feel better about ourselves. Because one of the things, I've done some focus groups with grad students, and the grad students who are in less privileged places are more worried than the grad students who are. Like the grad students who are going to the R1 institutions are like, oh, I'll just hang out here another year and maybe the job market will get better. Or like the incoming grad students are like, oh, well, I mean, this is going to be fine after 4 years of grad school. Like, I'm just going to keep going on my current trajectory. I've already committed this time and effort and energy and possible future that they're not really, you know, adjusting. They're just doubling back down. And I feel like it's to make themselves feel better.
So, Thomas, do you think they're lying to themselves?
I don't know if lying to themselves, like clearly the stock market's doing fine. So the graph of rich people feelings, they're doing all right. But for, say, the university I'm at, like it's pretty bleak at the R3. So, but the R1 people are doing just fine. Like, especially so in Texas right now, you know, it's all frozen, no power, no electricity. The school that one of my friends goes to is an R1 downtown Dallas school. They just put all of their students up in a hotel. And at our tiny little rural school, the school is lit, there is water, there is heat, and the entire town around the school is black.
Wow.
And we don't have power or water or anything. So it depends on where you're at. Like, I don't know if those R1 privileged PhD students are lying to themselves, because I don't know if their life is going to change.
Wow. Oh, Thomas, I'm so glad you and I have met. Can I just say, and obviously I'm going to go straight to Leanne McRae back again. So let's do this, because Leanne, the idea that the stock market again is a proxy for anything at all, or real estate capitalism is a proxy for anything at all, is stunning to me. And I wonder whether that finally it took COVID to create an awareness of what the global financial crisis actually did. Yeah, over a decade later, so 2007, 2008, that a few people through derivatives trading destroyed the global economy, spent the public purse, so public money could no longer go to health and education. And only now with COVID, with a pandemic, do you see what happened when the public purse was used to bail out the banks, which were too big to fail. Are we now there, Leanne, putting that out?
No, we're not. No, seriously, we're not, because people are still using the same language. People are still talking about, the reason why we're still in this, yo-yo situation is because, we've got to get the economy going. It's a language of economy that is prioritized and not a language of health and well-being. And I even hate the word well-being, so you know how dire it is if I'm saying it.
Me too, yeah.
They're still using that language. And
so, okay, let's you and I go hard. So this has happened. People have died. Public health has failed. Public education, kids are at school attempting to be educated. The culture has fragmented. Now, if this hasn't been the moment for colleagues, this structure hasn't worked, the GFC destroyed us, don't let those crew disempower us again. If this consciousness moment couldn't happen now, will it ever occur, Leanne McRae?
It will, because I do think that this is eventual.
Right, more?
I think this is not just an eruption where, something dodgy has happened, crisis, but yet nothing really changes. I think we are in the process of a radical change. I think the teething of that radical change is incredibly painful, and people are in crisis, and some people in very, very real crisis. Other people in a crisis and pretending they're not, which is really interesting. I think we're now, as we move into phase 2 with the vaccine rollout, where there seems to be an attempt to get things back to the way they were, when people haven't realised it's not going back to the way it was, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yeah. And I'm not making light of people. There's some real issues here. There's people dying. There's people who are being disenfranchised. There's fragmentation. There's deep isolation. Yes, absolutely. And that's a moment where our tropes of happiness have been stripped away, and for us to find new ways of being. And yet we keep on trying to go back to, where's my happiness? Where's my happiness gone?
Business is normal. We're getting back to normal.
Yes.
I mean, that's been the goal.
Yes, get back to normal. And normal wasn't good before this happened. It wasn't good.
And now millions of people have died. So let's go back to that normal and pretend all those millions upon millions of people who have lost a spouse, a child, a father, a mother, a that we can forget all of that. That'll be fine. I know they died, but just we're getting back to normal. It'll never be normal again for those people.
No, for millions of people, it's never going to be normal ever again. And I think we need strategies to manage that. That's more than... and I know getting back to work is so important for so many people. It's yes, absolutely. But I think also that premise needs to be challenged. What does it mean to live in a post-scarcity society? What does that mean? How are we going to support people? I mean, we had this case recently here in WA, Western Australia, where we had a 5-day lockdown, because we've been really lucky here. We're not lucky. We've had full-on, let's lock the borders and nobody's allowed in.
So, Liam, Western Australia is that big state on the west, mate, and basically we call it the People's Republic of Western Australia, right? They've stopped people coming in and out of that state basically for a year, mate, right?
Yeah, And look, we live a relatively like cruisy life here. It's like we can go to the pub, it's cool, you know. But we just had a 5-day lockdown because of a quarantine security worker tested positive, you know. But what nobody talked about was that he was also an Uber driver. And so there were a list of 16 locations that he went to, because, you know, and some of those were, you know, granted they weren't always his Uber jobs, but this idea that maybe he got it because he was tired, maybe he got it because he was working 2 jobs, and you know, we have now normalized this. We've normalized this as somebody who's you know, doing the right thing. And nobody's taking a step back and saying, that's really a tough life to live. And we want to go back to that. We want to go back to, you know, this, you know, people having to juggle 2, 3, 4 jobs. And I've done it. I've had 4 jobs.
You have.
You know, and it's hard. And maybe he was tired. Maybe he had a lapse in concentration. Maybe something like that happened. And that's how he got himself into a situation where he was now a spreader.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he wasn't, because we've had no cases since he tested.
But again, that's what I mean about the decontextualization of all of this conversation. Absolutely, Leanne. And gorgeous Emily, I'm going to go straight to you, because your comments are a great one about the Australian response to the pandemic. And it has been socialist. It has been committed to the public good. But if you remember, Emily, in some ways it didn't start that way, because it was all about the language at the start was mimicking Boris was mimicking that we can't have the cost of public health be the economy, right? So it started there. Then, of course, people started to die, Liam.
We also had the added caveat of Brexit as well on top of that. So our economy was going to crash, essentially.
Yeah,
and our currency.
It was going to crash anyway. It was unbelievable. But Emily, I wonder if we hadn't had New Zealand to shame us. Those of you that know Jacinda Ardern around the world, a remarkable leader. I wonder if we hadn't had New Zealand shaming us and showing us how to manage a public health crisis, whether Australia would have done as well. Have you got an opinion on that, Emily?
Yeah, and I agree. And I also think the worst is probably yet to come in Australia, because when JobKeeper stops is when the shit's going to hit the fan in terms of, and so many people did fall through the cracks. So when I say it was a socialist response, it worked for many, but not for all. I mean, I work in the arts, so like a lot of, you know, so many arts workers weren't covered by JobKeeper. Yes. And what will happen now is, the problem is with the idea of the snapback, that those jobs that were there before just aren't there now. So once those economic safety nets go, they'll be gone for good, as opposed to seeing it as a moment to say, oh, we could reconfigure, we could relook at the way that economies work. And of course, that's such an idealistic vision that I have. This is a moment that could lead to that, and it won't. And that will be very sad, and not just sad, but devastating for how people live. I just felt like there was this moment where I go, oh, well, the government is kind of taking a lead, but yes, it's for weird reasons and not in a sustainable way. So, yeah.
So well said. And again, Emily, you saw my sort of desperation in response to Leanne's commentary about if we didn't all have this collective moment of consciousness and respect for the public good and public health and public education now, if we didn't snap out of it now, will we ever snap out of it? Have you got a view on that, Emily, at all? I mean, you know, do you believe there will be a change? So in other words, or we still have this happiness project?
I think it's pretty difficult to unpick. I mean, again, the idealist in me thinks maybe generationally things can change. However, I've been thinking that for, you know, I mean, I'm in my late 40s, so I've been thinking that for a generation now already. So, so I guess one does sort of think, okay, well, you know, people who are now, I mean, Liam, you're very young, like late 20s, or people are even in their teens now, living through the very real impact of this. There might be enough of a kind of a groundswell of, oh, okay, we need to reconfigure things differently. But I suspect that will, as it always has, continue to be a small pocket of people trying to make radical change or even gradual change. Yeah. Whereas those that inherit the privilege, as we were saying before about the people who are still okay, they'll just carry on, and they continue to also wield the power. So yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, but mostly like, I don't know, I think change is too hard.
And there is a line to put on a t-shirt, Emily. You are a legend. I want to summon the wonderful Alyssa, if I can. Hello, Alyssa. To sort of do our final sort of denouement of our extraordinary session today. I feel very moved. I don't know about anybody else. I feel quite shaky inside. This has been very moving and very deep for me. And therefore, Alyssa, darling, I did want to go to you if I can. You've made those wonderful comments about your mum and your mum's role. Do you want to just speak to that for a moment? And then I want to sort of bring us round to feminism and unhappiness, Alyssa, darling.
Well, so my mum has had a feminist awakening. Kind of, she would say that she's always been a feminist, but lately she's been very angry, and it's good. But growing up, like, my mom took on a very traditional housewife role. She was basically the parent, and dad worked, but she also worked. But she would work nights, so it wouldn't disrupt her household duties. So she managed to have, like, she'd do cleaning jobs, and she would, before I was born, she was a manager at a post office, and she had like a solid career trajectory that she was passionate about. But when she had kids, it made sense for her to stay home and for dad to work. And then slowly over time, things got very deeply entrenched pattern-wise, in that it made her happy to make dad dinner. It made her happy to be able to come to our sports days. And I think now, you know, she's an empty nester, if you don't include the cats. And I think she maybe is thinking, did she make the right decisions for herself, but also setting as an example for me, because she's constantly telling me not to make the same mistakes that she did.
Wow.
Whilst also refusing to kind of acknowledge that she made mistakes, because it made her happy to be able to do them. And so she won't be very critical of my dad, because she's grateful that he worked so hard so that she had the opportunity to fulfill that idea of happiness.
Right. Is anybody else getting a bit teary here, or is it just me? I'm quite emotional at this. I'm looking at Melanie's face. It's like, I'm very upset. And you've captured this book really, because where I thought we'd finish, Alyssa, and I'm very, very mussed up from what you've said there, and give my love to your mum because she's a legend. But about the middle of the book, there was a quote from Sara Ahmed where she stated, there is a desire to believe that women become feminists because they are unhappy. Now, firstly, I'm a big believer in everybody can be a feminist. Men can be a feminist, non-binary, identifying crew. That feminism is a politics, has nothing to do with your genitals. But am I wrong? Am I wrong on that? So if you've got a particular configuration of a genital, then that renders you a particular form of a feminist, and it's triggered because you're unhappy. Tell me about unhappiness, happiness, and politics and feminism, mate.
I don't know. For me, watching my mum and some of my friends who I've seen kind of take some of those steps, it has come from a moment of unhappiness.
Yes.
Or realization that something isn't fair, or witnessing something like that, which I think is kind of unhappiness in a way. I don't know how you can really be radical or like want to change things if you're really happy with how they are. But I also think that if you go too far into despair, you're not going to be able to do anything either, because then you give up.
See, I'm desperately interested in despair. I am desperately interested in the politics of despair. That phrase fascinates me, right? So why did you use despair, and what are you meaning by that word?
Well, I guess for me, despair is a kind of hopelessness. It's where you just can't. Like, you can't think of a way out of it. Everything's too hard. And for me, it's that kind of sad where you need someone to help you. So you can't do for yourself. So it goes beyond just being sad. Yeah.
So unhappiness creates feminism. Despair creates what? Immobility.
Yeah, I think immobility is... And you kind of have to blink yourself because everything becomes too overwhelming. And I think that is one of the things that we've kind of seen through the pandemic with doom scrolling and that constant feed of just bad shit going on, is that sometimes it gets too much and you stop being able to really see what's going on because it's just too much.
Now, Alyssa, let's now carry this home and bring this one home. So therefore, with the doom scrolling, is the bounce back, are you bouncing back to happiness, even if it is a litre of Chardonnay or a bucket of ice cream? So in other words, from that despair and doom scrolling, is there still this manic, irrational, confused, really pretty ignorant bounce to try and get that micro happiness where we started?
I think that I've seen a lot of self-care guides pop up, and it's all like, take a break from doom scrolling and like paint your nails or have a shower.
It's the personal hygiene reminders that concern me the most, mate.
There's a lot of those. Or, you know, reach out to a friend. And there has been a lot of things where I've seen people like, yeah, just have a glass of wine at the end of the day. Or they indulge in trashy TV because it's escapism. So I think what I've seen is people desperately clinging to these little bits of happiness. Or like, you know, they'll stop doom scrolling and they'll just start watching happy puppy videos. And it's kind of like a way to close your eyes to all the bad stuff and kind of, I guess, reorientate yourself into this happy rainbow world of wine and dogs.
And firstly, we really need to sort of finish there. I saw Thomas was about to go on the wine and dogs. So can I say that is, I'm going to put that on T-shirts. I've got so many T-shirt slogans from the last 50 minutes. Thomas, I saw you just ready to go on the wine and dogs. So have you got any commentary about excessive drinking?
I was going to build off of the doom scrolling because I'm not entirely convinced that doom scrolling isn't searching for happiness.
Come on.
And that we doom scroll on social media because it's the only community that we have, and it's currently being hyper commodified, like this very voice video chat right now. Somebody's making big bucks off of us talking about this.
Are they?
Well, it's on Zoom.
Good point.
Yeah.
And of course, I paid the subscription. So they've made money off me. So I've got this, so it's a secure channel for us.
So somebody's making money off of our need for community, and the doom scrolling, I feel like, is just an extension of that because it's human contact when we don't have it.
And so, Thomas, you have finished us where you started us, that there is no outside of this conversation, and even despair is not taking us outside of this commodified happiness. Incredible. Colleagues, I've had one of the truly great scholarly moments of my life in the last 50 minutes. I feel so privileged to be sharing this planet with you. Thank you for this time. And even though it's had to be commodified and I had to pay Zoom, I'm very happy to have subsidized this commitment to public good. You are wonderful humans. Sleep well for the people in the middle of the night. Have a lovely afternoon. Have a lovely day to the Australians and the Kiwis. See you,
Thank you, Tara. Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
darling.
See you next week.
See you, Creamer. See you next week, darling. Love you. Great hair. See you, mate. Bye-bye.